All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we're going to talk about the inconvenient truth. The fact that the government is simply not going to be able to pay your bills when a disaster wipes out your home. What do we do about it, and why aren't we having that conversation? Sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. All right, welcome back. Thanks again for all your feedback over at www.insidemycanoehead.ca. We appreciate it, good, bad, or indifferent. Remember, if there's something in the disaster space, preparedness space, or something else that you would love to hear an episode on, drop us a line, jeff@preparednesslabs.ca. The email's right down on the website. I get those personally. None of the staff here touch it. And we'll see what we can do, right? Podcast is free. It's the best evidence-based, non-apocalyptic preparedness information that's out there. We just recently cracked the #1 household preparedness podcast. So I want to thank everybody and all of our listeners for that. We're rapidly approaching 25,000 downloads with over 300 episodes. And all of this is because you keep coming back and listening to us here at the Inside My Canoe Head. So I greatly appreciate it. But listen, we need to have some tough conversations, and that's what today's episode is about. We want to talk about the tough conversation about we're driving the train towards a cliff when it comes to disaster recovery, and nobody seems to be looking out the window, or the conductor's asleep. You can use whatever metaphor, analogy, euphemism, whatever you want to put in that space is perfectly fine. Right now, in most Western nations, the federal government acts as the disaster insurer of last resort. So what that means, people who were underinsured or uninsured for whatever reason and had a significant loss for which they cannot afford, they apply through the levels of government, and it differs by country, so I'm not going to be nation specific here. In Europe and Canada and the US, Mexico, the Caribbean, it all works slightly differently. But basically lowers the level of government, move this up. And in the end, in some locations, an individual can receive up to 80% of their catastrophic loss simply because they didn't have insurance and the government taxpayer bailed them out. Now, if you look at the continued costs and the exponential rising costs of disasters, especially here in North America, but we saw some great, not great, but horrible flooding events in Spain where hundreds of people died, and the insurance losses are incredible. And then you look at the totality of dollars spent by a government, and as it generally goes forward. I mean, this year alone, FEMA in the United States has had to come back to Congress for 3 additional allocations of funding. They've blown through their budget. We're talking tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of money that's being expended by governments for uninsured or underinsured losses. At this exponential growth, my mathematical calculations, and this is based upon my own mathematical calculations, not upon any significant amount of research that's been done, though I know there are some people doing it out there. We have about 10 years. In about 10 years, if the frequency and severity of disasters continue to increase and the costs continually to grow exponentially, in about 10 years, the federal government in the United States of America and most common Western governments will simply no longer possess the fiscal room to be able to pay these bills. So in essence, it doesn't matter whether you agree with this or not. I mean, it's really one of those pointless conversations, not pointless conversation, but pointless feelings and opinions type of thing, right? This train is going off the cliff. Could be earlier than 10 years, but it's probably about 10 years. Call it 2035. You're going to have a major disaster. Somebody's going to lose their home, and there's no insurance covering it because it's an act of God, and the government simply can't pay any money, and the family will simply have to declare bankruptcy and walk away from everything, right? That's the train we're driving towards. That's the eventuality we're headed towards as a collective society. My question that I put in a Substack article, and if you follow me over at Jeff Donaldson over at Substack, it's free of charge, just like the podcast. I don't have a paywall on my Substack. Everything is out there. I put an article in long detail, and some of it is going to be the basis for much of what we talk about today. If you prefer the information and the argument in the written form, it's over there on Substack. So feel free to subscribe. I don't get any money for it. I don't run advertising. There are people who like to consume it in different mediums, and next week we're going to start the video series of this. So we're going to start a videotaping exercise. And we're going to provide longer form YouTube videos. So basically you can get this material in the written form, the audio form, and the visual form, depending on which you prefer to consume. Always free. But the point is that when we run out of money and people are left with nothing, people are going to be upset. But we're not having that tough conversation now. When we have a little bit of room, a little bit of runway to be able to come up with some new policies, new initiatives, new ways of thinking about insurance to move this conversation forward so that we don't get to that position, so that we don't run the government's bill through the roof to a point where the government can't pay. Remember, these things are all exponentially growing as our healthcare costs, as our education costs. We're going to get to a position, irrespective of your political ideology, there are very real limitations on what a government can pay for, right? It doesn't matter what the need is. I really don't care what the need is. You park that aside. The reality is there's only a limited amount of money that the government can spend because it first has to either extract that money from the working population through taxation. I'm not anti-taxation. It's, we pay for the services, but it has to withdraw the money from through taxation from the individuals, or it has to borrow it from the grandchildren. Right? So any country out there that's running deficit financing right now, which I think is pretty much everybody, they're literally raising a portion of the budget from the existing taxpayer, and then they're borrowing the rest from the kids in daycare, right? That's essentially what they're doing. They're borrowing it from the kids in the daycare and burdening the kids in daycare with this future debt. That eventually runs out. There is an upper limit to that, and then we have to have tough choices. So, for example, if I would say to you, you've got 3 choices and you can invest in 2. You can invest in healthcare, education, or disaster losses. Pick 2. The other one just doesn't get any more money, and it'll be what it'll be. You say, no, we can't do that. We have to invest in all. Let's equally, no. We're not having the tough conversation as a society, and that's my argument and the impetus for today's conversation and discussion about disaster losses. Now, I think there's 2 main issues with this. One is personal responsibility, and the second is government indemnification, so the government paying the bill. The fact that exists is causing a whole bunch of other things to occur. So number 1, personal responsibility. Let's look at medical insurance. Now, I'm a Canadian, so we have this duty and responsibility here in Canada because we have a publicly delivered and publicly funded, privately delivered healthcare system in Canada, right? So our hospitals, our doctors' offices, all of our clinics, they're all private corporations. But they deliver the healthcare based upon need and not based upon money. So you can't, for the most part, purchase services to get ahead of the line based upon your money. So, but there's a duty and responsibility that goes along with having access to that system. That's the duty and responsibility for the individual to do everything within their power to maintain a strong, positive physical and mental health, so that they themselves limit their need to access the system and they don't become a burden. Those people who get injured through trauma and events beyond their control then have access to a great system that's well-funded and ready to help them because things happen that are beyond their control. We don't advocate for that. That's a separate upcoming podcast to argue why we need to start doing that. But in America, where they charge, where you have to buy insurance to get your medical coverage, you get some type of deduction, some type of benefit for being healthy, right? So when you're younger, which is obviously changes as you get older, but when you don't smoke, when you keep great positive health, you're cheaper to insure. You're cheaper to insure because your likelihood of accessing non-trauma related care is far lower, right? There are things that are beyond our control. You could be born like a birth defect, right? I just recently found out I had one, and I've got a bunch of surgeries coming up that I have to do it. I shouldn't have to pay more or because of that, because it was beyond my control, right? But there are things in my healthcare that are within my control, and I should get a benefit for making smart, intelligent choices about my own health, right? Insurance works the same as let's talk about your life insurance, right? There's generally two rates, smoker and non-smoker. If you choose to smoke, you'll pay a higher premium because there are higher costs associated with providing life insurance to those who choose to use tobacco. It's not a rocket science. Everybody understands it. When you get your life insurance premium in most places every year, they swab your mouth to make sure that there's no tobacco, whatever. I don't know what they do. I'm not an expert in tobacco swabbing. But the point is that we have an accepted system where the higher degree of risk that is within your control, that means those additional costs are all yours to bear, right? So, for example, if you chose not to keep a strong mental and physical health through, as long as it's not things beyond your control, and you chose not to exercise and you chose to eat unhealthy, why should you get the same access to health care as somebody who did choose, right? Not traumatic events, not things that are beyond your control, but very clearly things that are due to decisions you made, knowing full well that those were not healthy decisions. Why should you get the same access as everybody else? I'm not going to make that argument. That's just a point that exists in insurance. You do the things that are within your control, kind of like what we talk about on here when it comes to Stoic philosophy, right? Everything in the world generally falls into one of two categories. It's very stovepipe-ish. It's not really 100% applicable, but if you think about it, everything that's happening around you is either within your control and it's not. Now, things that are within your control you can mitigate, and things that are outside of your control you can mitigate. But in the end, you can't absolutely control everything that happens around you. So through life insurance and medical insurance, you can mitigate your risk and therefore should receive a lower premium, a lower cost to insure that things because you're making decisions that are within your control, right? But still being protected by things that are beyond your control. We do the same thing in car insurance now. Most insurance agents will base it upon a whole bunch of things. They'll use your credit score because your credit score is a good indication of how well you take care of yourself. They will look at a whole bunch of other circumstances. But then what they will also look at is people can put devices. Now, I'm with Desjardins Insurance. I had a device in my car that monitored my driving for a period of time. And based upon that, I got a certain discount on my premium because I was a safer driver. Right? Now, maybe I acted that way when the device was in my car. Whatever. The point being is I was given an opportunity to prove that I was a lower risk individual. And by proving that I was a lower risk individual, I therefore mitigated my risk and I therefore had a lower premium, right? So everybody played their part as much as possible. Now, when we move into the difficult area of housing, there's a number, it becomes quite literally far more complex than simply just saying do the mitigating things and get a lower rate, right? So let's start with the personal responsibility that exists. Number one is, in most countries, for the vast majority of humans, you are free. You have the ability to move around. Now, yes, there are some vulnerable populations who can't, but for the vast majority, the significant tax-paying majority of the country, you have the ability and the authority to move around, which means you've chosen where you live because you like where you live. You enjoy where you live. So you made a conscious choice, pluses and minuses, as to where you live and the risks that exist there. But you're like, hey, you know what? I love the West Coast of the United States of America, the Northwest Coast. I live in Oregon or Washington State, or if I'm Canadian, I live in the province of British Columbia. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. But I live in the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake risk, right? I accept that by living there. I've made a conscious choice to live in a location that carries a significant risk of a hazard being realized, right? Now, you probably made that conscious choice, or maybe you didn't make the conscious choice, and here you are finding yourself in the middle of a place and somehow realizing that it exists. The likelihood is you understood that, but you still decided to go there. Right. So then what are your responsibilities to mitigate against the risk that you voluntarily assumed by choosing the location where you live? Very, very simply, did you buy a house that was mitigated against it? Like if you're in an earthquake zone, did you buy a house that is protected seismically? Did you buy a house that has the ability to be insured against an earthquake? These are things that we can reasonably expect that you as an adult would do prior to purchasing a house inside a known hazard area. Now, you can argue that this education is not provided out there. I can argue back that you're a grown arse adult and should probably figure this stuff out on your own. But here you are. You can choose to purchase a home that, number one, has built-in mitigations against a hazard, flood, earthquake, hurricane, whatever it may be. And you also should be purchasing a home that you can afford to insure against the hazards in which you're exposed. Those are decisions that are your responsibility prior to moving in. And if you can't find something that fits that and you still want to live in the area, well, then maybe renting some residence is going to be the right decision for you because you can't afford the risk mitigation measures that are within your control, and therefore you're going to just simply go with contents insurance for relocation to just cover the things that you have, and you're not going to buy insurance or be responsible for the structure. Those are all decisions that are well within your purview to do. The problem with that argument, and I wrote this again, I have a problem with my own argument, and it's perfectly fine. This is the brilliance of open discussion. I don't pretend to have the ideal solution. The problem we have is, what do we do with the population who are stuck? And I mean the people who are already own a residence in a high-risk area, and because of the exponential growth of the cost of disasters over the last couple of decades, they've now been priced out of the insurance market. When they bought the home, they could afford, but now that insurance is growing exponentially, they can no longer afford. So they've done nothing wrong. They even made the smart choices like I spoke about, but now they're stuck in a position where they can no longer afford to insure the house they have. What are their options? Right now, what happens is they buy the insurance they can, and in the highly unlikely but disastrous event where they have a total loss or a significant loss, the government comes in to pay for that. If I say to you that that's no longer an option, and the only option other than your personal savings account is the insurance that you can buy, and you can no longer buy insurance, and you don't have the savings account to cover 100% of the cost of your rebuild, you're stuck, because if you try to sell your house, you're going to face the same questions. Your buyer's going to make the same questions and realize they can't afford to insure. The government can't afford to bail it out. And therefore, the value of the house is 50% less than what you bought it for. And you're sitting on $250,000, $500,000 financial loss simply because of the state of the insurance market. What do we do for the people who are in that situation? Now, I think it's a one-time fee that resets the market, and then everybody that point forward buys in knowing exactly what they're doing, and there's no government funding and there's no buyouts for them, that we have a one-time agreement for people who sell, say their house is worth $1 million if you can insure it, $500,000 if you can't insure it. They sell it for $500,000 because the buyer can't get insurance. They lost $500,000, and it gets covered by a one-cost thing. Initial idea research, and I like to call it that because it's not peer-reviewed and it's not statistically defendable at this point. So I call it initial idea research. Tells me that is far cheaper than actually continuing to cover disaster losses. I don't have statistical evidence to back that up. and I would never say so unless I did. But initial look at it, if we look at the houses that are in that position and the value versus the replacement cost of the house, the likelihood is that it's cheaper to do it that way. But that's just an answer. I mean, I don't pretend or profess to have the ideal solution for the problem set we're facing. The question that I'm raising is, why aren't we having this conversation, right? I'll give you an example. I live in the city of Ottawa, obviously, the location of the studios of Inside My Canoe Head. And guess what? This is an earthquake zone. But your standard insurance policy from your broker will not cover earthquakes. You need to purchase an additional rider. And for me, it was $485 for the year on top of my insurance costs to buy the extra insurance policy to cover my house against earthquake. If we have a significant earthquake, and the last one I experienced was 2009, and I literally was almost knocked out of my chair at my office because it shook so bad. If we had another significant event like that, and we had a great deal of homes lost, I'm going to argue with you that the vast majority of people simply did not buy the rider. What they did is they shopped around for the minimum legal insurance required when they purchased the home. They simply looked for the lowest bidder from the broker, and they went with that, paid the minimum amount of money they could, and carried on with life, thinking they won the day. All of those 100,000 people in the city of Ottawa that would have earthquake damage that was uninsurable by their current policies would look to the government for some type of insurance. And my point is no, you pay for that out of savings or you go bankrupt. You knew you lived in an earthquake zone. You chose not to pay for the insurance. So why, after you make those choices, are the taxpayers of Canada responsible to rebuild your house? Because that's where the money is coming from. Governments can't create money. They have to extract it or borrow it, one of two things. So everybody else in the country who's working and provided money to the government has now have to pay to rebuild your home. You may agree or disagree with that comment, but again, it's about fueling the conversation that we're not having about the idea that the government as the insurer of last resort is coming to a close. That concept is coming to a close. The government will not be able to keep up with the exponential growth and the cost and the expense of disasters. Insurance companies have to price their market for profitability. They're a private corporation, and trust me, public insurance run by the government in no way, shape, or form could be run anywhere near as efficiently and properly as a private insurance company. You can argue with me that. Love to. Jump onto LinkedIn or jump onto my Substack and fire away on the comments. Happy to engage with you on that. I've never seen a government program in an area run more efficiently than a private sector program. They just don't know how to do it. And I worked in the federal government for almost 3 decades, and they just can't do efficiency. So if that's not a solution, if what I'm saying here is not a solution, then what is, right? Because right now, this is, and I've talked about this all the way back like a year, almost 2 years ago when I flew down to Halifax to be a guest on an incredible podcast called Matter of Facts. I was asked, what's the one thing that somebody can do right now to get ready to increase their preparedness? What's the one thing? And my answer was read your insurance policy, right? It's the number one risk transfer that we do across all the spectrums I talked about today. Life insurance, health insurance, auto insurance, housing insurance, contents insurance, long-term disability, short-term disability. Read your insurance policy. You need to understand that document intimately. And don't give me the excuse that it's all legalese. That's BS. That's just an excuse for you not to do the work. You signed an insurance policy. You think it protects you for X. You better be damn sure you're correct. If you have a loss, what exactly are the processes that are to be followed? What is the insurance company's responsibility? And by the way, what are the exact tasks that the insurance company is expecting you to execute when an event occurs? Because you have personal responsibilities in your insurance document, There are things you must do. And oh, by the way, if the insurance covers a replacement residence, is an appropriately sized residence for your size of family even available in your area? And if it is, what is the going rent, right? Does the amount of money that the insurance company is willing to provide for a replacement residence for short-term repairs, does that equal the cost of what you would have to get in the area? You may actually be spending more money because guess what? If you have a total loss to fire or earthquake, you still have to pay your mortgage. There's a hole in the ground. You have to pay the mortgage and all the other costs that people don't talk about. Remediation to the site. You have to keep protecting the site. If it's a hole in the ground and it poses a danger to people, you're responsible to protect other people from injuring themselves on your burned out house. Like, there are a whole series of things and responsibilities that are embedded in your insurance contract that I'm pretty sure 90% of you don't know. Right? You just went for the lowest cost provider from the broker that gave you the minimum $2 million or whatever it was that was required by your mortgage company for fire insurance. You bought it, you signed the deal, you high-fived and you closed on the house and you never again looked at it. Most people out there, and I've done this insurance thing a couple of times, so I'm going to be adamant about this. I will argue the vast majority of people listening to this podcast have no idea the exact specifics of their coverage of their insurance. Yet it's the single biggest risk transfer that you can do. Full stop. And I'll answer, if you don't want to do it, that's fine. Just make sure that your savings account has enough money to cover a replacement house. And I'm pretty sure for the majority of people listening to this podcast, that answer is no. There is not $720,000 of free balance sitting in my savings account that I could use to rebuild my house when I have an uninsured loss and now that the government has run out of money, right? Let's be clear. You want daycare, you want pharmacare, you want healthcare, you want education, you want a robust military to fight the bad guys, you want robust protection agencies to protect the environment, and all these other things that you want the government to do competes with their ability to pay out disaster losses. It's about choices. We don't do that well. I know here in Canada, I'll speak for my country, we are not very good at having tough choices, right? If we had to say at the provincial level, costs are getting big, we can only choose one, healthcare or education. Like, we've got to go all in on one of them for a 4-year term to really fix it. The other one, we're just going to hope and pray that it survives, right? That would be a logical, intelligent way to address it. But no, what everybody will demand is incremental little bits in each, little programs here and there to make people happy. And yet we never really change anything. It just gets exponentially more expensive. We can't keep funding everything that happens in our society out of magical government money. Right? Because that first has to be extracted from hardworking people and from the grandchildren and the children in the daycare. So why don't we have the conversation about the things that we can do as individuals to mitigate our own risk, champion that, and then have the conversation, what do we do? How do we help the people who are in tough positions through no ill action of their own? Right? They did nothing wrong. They did everything right. It's the same as that I use this reference in my Substack article when I talked about the reference to capitalism. When I was getting at there is, we know that capitalism is the greatest wealth generation way of running an economy. You can argue, I don't care. But what we don't do well, right? What we don't do well is set up systems to take care of the people who follow the rules, who compete and lose, right? A few win, which is why incentives work, and they win big. The majority win, but they win okay, which means they have a surviving life, a happy life in the middle. But there are an equal percentage, a small percentage, just like the small percentage that win exponentially, there's a small percentage that lose exponentially. They followed the rules, they did the thing, they gave it a shot, and they were unsuccessful. What capitalism does not do a very good job is taking care and setting up provisions to deal with people who try but don't succeed, right? Now, that is normally and I'm going to say these words, it's going to cheese a bunch of people off. In a properly functioning capitalist system, taxation is imposed on successful transactions to cover the costs of those who are unsuccessful. That's how it's supposed to work. So capitalism in of itself is a zero cost to the government because there's additional taxation within the capitalist system that is used to fund those who try to succeed but are unsuccessful and need some type of fiscal support to navigate the world of capitalism, right? It's supposed to work that way. I'm not sure anybody's got it nailed correctly. There's always some and go, but in the end, capitalism should be a zero cost initiative, right? It just shouldn't cost the governments anything to set up and run a capitalist system. But ideology aside, that's the type of thing we need to discuss. There are people who will do all the right things, and there are people who will try their butts off, who will do everything they can to stay healthy physically and mentally. They'll make smart financial decisions. They'll eat healthy. And then bad things happen to good people. We need to have conversations about how do we protect and how do we preserve those who do nothing wrong, yet are faced with calamity due to reasons beyond their control, right? And so that's part of the outcome. That's one of the outcomes of the conversation that hasn't even started and we're not having about how do we fund disasters. Right now, the insurance companies can do what they will, and they are a private company, and so they can raise insurance companies so they remain profitable. Once they price people out of the market, they walk away because the government's going to pick up the difference. But what if we didn't? And I'll end with this final example. Look at the American medical system. I don't care what your opinions are of it. If somebody has a massive uninsured medical bill, they go bankrupt. Everybody gets a small piece of the pie. They walk away and they restart with a 200 credit score, and they start again. Why can't disaster losses be treated that way? Why can't we just say to people that if you can't afford to fix your earthquake damaged home because you didn't buy rider insurance, you're done. You're on your own. Sell it. Sell it for a hole in the ground. Maybe you'll get a couple $100,000. Maybe you'll cover some of the mortgage that you owe and you'll just maybe have to go bankrupt and start again. You may say, whoa, we can't do that. Well, okay then. Great. That's a wonderful opinion. But you can't just say that and then go have a Starbucks latte. You have to comma that. How am I going to address that? How am I going to provide that? And the answer can't be government money. If I put you in those parameters and I put you in that box, what is it that you come up with? I'd love to hear. Go over to our Substack article under my name, Jeff Donaldson, on Substack. Go over to LinkedIn. I republish it there as a LinkedIn article. Send me an email through the contact information at insidemycanoehead.ca. Let's engage in the conversation. Let's start this and have a debate about what do we do knowing people are going to be uninsured and have uninsured losses and the government can't pay for them. What do we do to cover it? Bankruptcy is an option. Something else is an option. Let's have that conversation. Thanks again for joining us this week at Inside My Canoe Head. We appreciate you coming back. Thank you to the new subscribers. Remember, everything we do here will be free and it always will be free. We've now reached the exalted level as the #1 household preparedness podcast. I appreciate all your support. We're encroaching in on 25,000 downloads. We're on 63 countries. We added a couple of more this week. Appreciate all you people from around the world, differing locations, different experiences. We grow because you contribute. So if there's anything you can do for us here at Inside My Canoe Head, it's simply to share that we exist. Tell somebody else, I don't make any money. It spreads the word. Remember, you've got the written word on Substack. You've got the audio on the podcast Inside My Canoe Head. And you've got the video coming next week up on our YouTube channel at Preparedness Labs, which, by the way, has about 105 subscribers. You folks are awesome. Thanks for hanging out with us. We're getting a little bit better. We also throw up pretty much daily, several times a day, reels on Instagram, TikTok, etc. And it's under the name at Preparedness Labs. So thanks again to all of you for joining us here. Thanks for listening. Take care. Contribute to the conversation. We get better as a society when we have the hard conversations that make us feel uncomfortable. Take care and stay safe.